The activities described here took place on the traditional lands of the Wendat Nation, the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Anishinaabe, and other indigenous communities. The lab work that I will be mentioning later was mainly done in South Africa on the traditional lands of the Khoisan. We build on what they started. My name is Susan Pfeiffer, and for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about my experiences with repatriation and collaboration in an archaeological context. Before I get into my own experiences, I want to spend just a moment characterizing the differences between the United States and Canada. For those of you who may not be familiar with archaeology, you may get the impression that the acronym NAGPRA applies to archaeological human remains throughout North America. It does not. In the United States, what they call Aboriginal burials are a federal responsibility. And in 1990, they passed a law, the Native Grave Protection and Repatriation Act. It has since been amended, but it remains in effect. It requires mandatory compliance by any institution that receives any federal funds. And it is, in a sense, inflexible in that no human remains may represent ancestors that didn't have descendants. You have to find a descendant for any human remains from the confines of the United States. In Canada, contrarily, heritage is a provincial responsibility. So each province and territory of Canada has its own legislation that applies to human remains from an archaeological context. It is permissive rather than directive. That is, it allows things to happen, but it doesn't mandate things to happen. No province at this time has repatriation legislation. So by default, the emphasis is on consultation and dialogue. While there are many advantages to the NAGPRA approach, there are also disadvantages, and the sort of collaboration between academics and indigenous communities that I'm going to describe is hard to imagine in the NAGPRA context. So what about, I'm from the University of Toronto. And so to understand how repatriation happened at the University of Toronto, I think it's useful to get a little bit of history to the First Nations archaeology at the University of Toronto. University of Toronto's third president back in 1872 was a naturalist. I think he was born in Scotland, named Sir Daniel Wilson. He wrote a journal article for Nature called The Huron Skull. So there was an interest in who had lived in what was then being developed, being understood as Toronto back in the 1870s. In 1936, the University of Toronto established the first anthropology department in Canada. And from that point onward, there were many excavations, many research excavations. These were excavations that were done purposefully and often with the intent of training students on how to excavate. They were all kinds of archaeological sites, but primarily they were of the Indigenous peoples who lived not too far from Toronto. Whatever was excavated was kept at the Department of Anthropology. In 1975, the province of Ontario passed its initial antiquities legislation. And from that point onward, no site with human remains was excavated unless it was seriously threatened with destruction, like it was a discovery when a road was widened or something like that. There were no more what you might call educational training exercises having to do with human remains since 1975. Nevertheless, all of the human remains that had been previously excavated remained at the department. In 1999, the Department of Anthropology established a repatriation committee and established a policy that was proactive toward repatriation. And in 2013, the department collaborated with the Huron-Wendat Nation to repatriate over 1,700 skeletons representing the ancestors of the Wendat Nation. And now ongoing, the Anthropology Department and the Huron-Wendat Nation continue to collaborate on research from tiny gifts that the descendants decided the ancestors would be willing to part with in order to tell their stories. So we have one tooth per person that were retained, and we've been doing research to tell new stories about the ancestors. So here's a timeline to that repatriation. From 1999 to 2004, there was the development of the departmental policy. The department hired some consultants from established museums, both in Ottawa and in Washington, D.C., to give guidance to what might be done. That turned out not actually to be particularly helpful. And we tried to get some federal funding to support the activities associated with repatriation, which also wasn't successful. Between 2005 and 2012, there was a consortium of 3 Indigenous communities within Ontario and Quebec: the Huron-Wendat, the Six Nations of the Grand, and the Anishinaabe. They formed what was called the Founding First Nations Circle, and they collaboratively set out to try to get a wholesale repatriation of all the human remains held by the Department of Anthropology. And there were academics involved and lawyers involved. The bad news was that the collaboration among the communities did not gel, and they chose to drop their Founding First Nations Circle. This had nothing to do with the discussions about repatriation. It had to do with other matters. The good thing about that period is that we determined that we needed a permanent display, and we built, with input from all of our discussants, a permanent display in the main lobby of the Anthropology building at the University of Toronto St. George campus. It happens that that building is at the intersection of a east-west street and a north-south street called Huron Street. So that's pretty cool. So if you're ever at the Department of Anthropology at University of Toronto St. George campus, please do stop and look at uncovering our early past First Nations in Toronto. So that was a very cool outcome, but it did not get anything repatriated. After the collapse of the Founding First Nation Circle, the Wendat Nation decided to go it alone. And so that one of the 3 prior negotiating groups reinitiated discussions with University of Toronto, and because so much of the groundwork had already been laid, quite quickly we came to a memorandum of understanding. And in September 2013, a portion of the University of Toronto's holdings were repatriated. And that's what I'll be describing further here. These are These are ancestors from the 13th to the 17th centuries, things that archaeological sites from earlier than the 13th century are really cannot really be associated with a historically known group. So the further back in time, the less confidence you have about associating a particular archaeological site with a particular historically known group. And so I'll show you some pictures associated with the repatriation event. Since 2014 and in perpetuity and future, the department will be curating on behalf of the Huron-Wendat the one tooth per person that were gifted by the ancestors, and we work collaboratively on research publications. So the Memorandum of Understanding associated with the repatriation this is a picture from the Huron-Wendat Nations newsletter, English language edition. And in the end, there were two separate memoranda, one between the University of Toronto and the Huron-Wendat, the other between the Ontario Heritage Trust and the Huron-Wendat, because they supplied the land. And before I get into that, I'd like to read to you from the Yakwenda English edition, springtime 2013. Why must we rebury them today in 2013? According to our traditions, our ancestors are of utmost importance. Their wisdom and deeds are celebrated long after they are gone. They are present in our prayers and in our rituals. They are a part of our lives, and we believe that they still play a role in our society. This respect for the deceased extends not only to their spirits, but also to their remains. In fact, traditional teachings dictate that one of the souls, the memory of the deceased, is preserved in the bones. It is for this reason that we are very respectful of the bones of our ancestors. Once placed in an ossuary, the memories of the ancestors were intended to be at peace for eternity. Yet archaeologists, during the 20th century, many Wendat ossuaries were disturbed. The bones were unearthed by archaeologists and then studied and stored in universities for decades. As Wendat people, it is therefore our duty to ensure that they are returned to the earth, to the place they came from, if possible, so that they can finally find peace and dignity. We were very pleased that, in fact, one of the largest of the Wendat ossuaries, or collective burial places, had been excavated from land that remained in the public domain. And so the site where that excavation had occurred was still owned by the Ontario Heritage Trust. It's near Vaughan, Ontario. It was formerly the site of the Kleinberg Ossuary, which University of Toronto excavated in 1970. The Huron-Wendat Nation used it to inter all of their ancestors from the University of Toronto, and they renamed the site Donnacona. So those ancestors are now protected. The site has been rezoned as a cemetery, and that's that. They will not be further disturbed. The gifts that had been found with the human remains, the artifacts and animal bones, that kind of thing, were also reburied. Everything that was disinterred when human remains were excavated was reinterred in September 2013. Now, the actual reburial of the ancestors was a private affair, and I wasn't there. I have no, the Huron-Wendat requested that there be no media, there be no recordings, no photographs. It was to be a private family cemetery, uh, it was just to be private. But the previous day, in September 2013, we did hold a big celebration. This is the Great Hall at Hart House at the University of Toronto. We held a full day of talks about the Huron-Wendat Nation in Ontario. And there was simultaneous English-French translation. There was a midday feast. There was another evening feast. We had a very, very big send-off, in a sense, the day before. But the actual reburial and the treatment of the boxes that held the bones was all very private. So, the generous gift of a tooth. The Huron-Wendat descendants deliberated about this for a long time, but they ultimately decided that if the ancestors could provide new stories about their lives, it would be a worthwhile gift. From a single molar, like the one pictured here, we can take tiny, tiny samples to get information about a person's diet at different times during their life. We can get information about the environment in which they were born and raised versus the environment in which they were buried. In other words, did they move across the landscape? We can get a radiocarbon date. And from the inner part of the tooth, we can extract ancient DNA of both the person and diseases that might have been circulating in their bloodstream. And even if one tooth were used for all that, there would still be some tissue remaining. I say all this to emphasize that these days, and it's getting better all the time, scientific archaeology can operate with very small samples and has substantial confidence in the outcomes of the research. I'm not going to walk you through the details of all the research projects that we've done, but I do want to try to summarize some of the achievements that I think we have reached since 2013. We have corrected past misunderstandings about ancestral reliance on maize. Previous understandings suggested that maize had become so popular that it may have actually led to nutritional deficiency diseases, and that people might have had to back off the use of so much maize in the diet. That was based on data from a different tissue in the human body, and using dental data, we were able to get much more accurate information that suggests a simple, steady state reliance on maize, except in the 17th century, when communities were badly disrupted by conflict, there's an increase in maize and a reduction in protein sources. Secondly, we've got new knowledge about childhood lives. We know a lot now about when Wendat mothers chose to wean their babies. And we know that after babies, young toddlers, were weaned, girls tended to have a diet more oriented toward fish. Boys had a diet more oriented toward venison. In other words, children were following the sort of gender roles that we associate with men and women. We've found data for evidence of challenges caused by conflict. The 17th century saw lower dietary quality. Mothers were choosing to wean their babies at a younger age. And there is suggestion of food insecurity, which is what we see in conflict zones around the world today. So being disrupted and having to move frequently, having to move into landscapes that you don't know as well, having people be injured during warfare, all of these things had some of the same effects back in the 17th century that they have today. And finally, we've found some corroboration of narratives about population history. We've got information about the movement of villages from one region to another, close by, but still far enough away so that the land would have been fresh for cultivation and the hunting might have been better. And we've got a couple of wonderful examples of people who were buried in a Huron-Wendat cultural context, but who didn't have any maize in their diet as children, which suggests that there was the incorporation of new community members who may have come from quite far afield. And I like to think, and I hope I've convinced you, that repatriation and collaborative scholarship can be important steps toward reconciliation. And all of this is done by a whole bunch of people, many of them from the Wendat Nation in Wendoque, Quebec. And of course, we got support from the Ontario Heritage Trust, the University of Toronto administration were terrifically important, and then a large number of researchers who have worked as a labor of love on these various projects. So that's what I had to say, and I thank you for your attention.